I lost my husband in an accident just 1 month after our wedding. In my despair, I threw myself completely into my work and found success as an author. Behind that success, though, I was fighting a lonely battle until one rainy day changed my life dramatically. That was the day I met a man protecting his baby in the rain. It was already a hectic day when I arrived at one of the nation's most prestigious literary events. The glamour surrounding me stood in stark contrast to the evening's true purpose. This elegant gala was actually a charity event to raise funds for social housing projects. Many renowned authors, myself included, had donated hundreds of books, with all sales proceeds going to these projects. That evening offered the elite a chance to make a real difference in society, though for some it was just another opportunity to flaunt their wealth and status. I hate to say it, but I was quite noticeable that night. As one of the region's most talented writers, my presence was as prominent as the number of books I had donated. Yet despite my success, people were still talking about how I had changed after suddenly losing my young husband. They also knew I was taking care of my sick father. Some saw me as cold, but those who truly understood life's complexities knew this was just my way of facing adversity. During the event, I met Diane, an iconic figure in the literary world who commanded respect through her vast experience and achievements. When Diane saw me, she smiled warmly and told me how delighted she was to see someone as wonderful as me at the event. She mentioned hearing about how I was caring for my father despite my busy schedule, calling it admirable. I smiled politely and nodded, but I couldn't help feeling out of place in this superficial world. Sensing my unease, Diane gently suggested that while these events might seem superficial, they sometimes exceeded expectations in fundraising. She asked what had brought me there that day, sensing it wasn't purely for business. I gave her a sad smile and admitted I was there out of obligation, not desire. I explained that my life had never been just about writing, but was shaped by human experiences and lessons learned from my father. I paused for a moment, remembering those difficult days. I told her how my father always found ways to help others despite any hardships, describing him as a simple man with a big heart. I shared how he had raised me alone, and how all his sacrifices became life lessons for me. Diane listened intently, her face showing deep respect. She remarked that it was rare to find someone who maintained such values even after achieving success, and said my father must be an extraordinary person. I agreed, pride shining in my eyes. I told her how my father did everything from neighborhood repairs to tutoring, always saying that a person's greatest wealth lies not in what they have, but in what they can give to others. Diane nodded, understanding the depth of my words. She told me that many people could learn from who I was and how I lived my life and career. I smiled at her words, feeling understood for the first time that evening. I softly told Diane that I was simply trying to live in a way that would make my father proud. I explained how he had taught me that life's true meaning lay in building bridges between people and creating spaces for understanding and support. Diane smiled at me, with genuine respect, having herself risen from humble beginnings through hard work to reach one of the highest levels in our profession. Yet behind her eyes, I could see a hint of sadness, though few knew she had never built a family of her own. After the event, I headed home, to what had become more than just a living space, but truly my sanctuary. When I arrived, I found my father watching television, now living with me due to his illness. Despite his health problems, my father Eric maintained a bright heart and active spirit as the evening programs played on. He asked me with genuine interest how the event had gone and if we had raised much money. I took off my high heels and told him it went well, though I noted there were some people who seemed to think their money made them godlike, but overall it was successful. I mentioned my conversation with Diane about how important our work was for society. Then I stood up and walked to the kitchen, asking over my shoulder if he had any preferences for dinner. He responded with a grateful smile, telling me anything would be fine and not to fuss too much. While helping him prepare for bed later, we discussed tomorrow's schedule. I explained that I had an important project meeting in the morning, but everything was arranged and Deborah would come to take care of him. As he lay in bed, he looked at me with gentle eyes and told me I was a good daughter, to go do what I needed to do, and that he was proud of me. My father Eric had faced countless hardships in his life. After my mother abandoned us, he took on the enormous responsibility of raising me alone. Despite financial struggles, he always prioritized my education, believing it was the path to a better future. He devoted every penny he earned to my studies. I made the most of every learning opportunity he provided, and eventually became a successful author. Even after achieving success, I never forgot my father's struggles and sacrifices, continuing to care for him with the same love and gratitude I had felt since childhood. The next morning, I woke up early. I had barely slept before this important day, but I showered and chose an elegant dress that reflected both professionalism and femininity. This meeting was something I had been looking forward to for months. As I headed to the car, heavy rain suddenly began to fall. My driver, who was well acquainted with my schedule and routine, was waiting attentively. As I approached, he commented on how it looked like we would have rain for most of the journey. The rain was causing traffic chaos, and our car moved slowly through the congested streets. My mind was full of details about the upcoming meeting. But suddenly, through the foggy glass, my gaze stopped. Through the curtain of heavy rain, I saw a homeless man desperately trying to protect his baby. The contrast between my situation and this father and child struggling for basic shelter struck me deeply. In that moment, the importance of the meeting became secondary. I told my driver to stop the car, saying we needed to help this man. My driver, who knew my compassion for homeless people, stopped immediately. He cautioned me though, warning that I would get soaked and ruin my dress, reminding me of the important meeting ahead. I told him I didn't care about the dress or being late, those people needed help right now. With those words, I opened the car door and rushed out into the pouring rain. Approaching the man, I asked if I could help, telling him that he and the baby shouldn't be out here, asking if they had anywhere to go or any home. Though still startled, the man answered while shielding his baby from the rain, saying they had nowhere to go. I didn't need to know more about his situation to understand I had to act. In the heavy rain, I quickly returned to the car and asked my driver to open the glove compartment. I grabbed a set of keys and ran back to the man, whose name is David. I introduced myself as Kate and explained that these were the keys to my father's house nearby, telling him that since my father now lived with me, the house was empty and they could use it. I held out the keys to him. I explained that I had an important meeting to attend, but my driver would take them to the house. After giving him the keys, I hurried back to the car, already drenched from the rain. I told my driver I would walk to the meeting since it was close by, and asked him to take David and the baby to my father's house. I also asked him to stop at the market to buy necessities like food, clothes, and diapers for them. My driver, who was well familiar with my kindness, nodded immediately and confirmed he understood. The driver prepared to follow my instructions to take David and his baby to my father's house. Meanwhile, I started walking toward my important meeting. Though the rain was soaking my hair and dress, my steps were firm and determined. In my heart, I was thinking about what I had just done. I knew that while the meeting was important, helping that father and child was the most meaningful thing I could do in that moment. With that thought in my heart, I gradually made my way to my destination.
The chauffeur approached David with gentle reassurance in his voice, telling him not to worry and explaining that they would take him to a safe place. He emphasized that Kate simply wanted to help them. David clutched his baby closer to his chest, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and distrust as he gazed at the chauffeur. With visible hesitation, David expressed his uncertainty about trusting a stranger, admitting he knew nothing about Kate and couldn't easily believe in such unexpected kindness. The chauffeur, understanding David's apprehension, tried to calm his fears. He acknowledged David's feelings while assuring him of Kate's genuine kindness and pure intentions to help. Reaching for his wallet, the chauffeur pulled out a family photograph. He showed it to David, explaining that as a father himself, he could vouch for Kate's character, having worked with her for many years and witnessed her compassion firsthand. David studied both the photograph and the chauffeur's earnest expression carefully, still wary but beginning to sense that this might be a genuine opportunity for safe shelter. Finally, he agreed to go with them, carefully climbing into the car while holding his baby protectively. The chauffeur first drove them to a nearby market, where he purchased food, dry clothes, and baby supplies including diapers. Finally, he took them to Kate's father's house as promised. Overwhelmed by such kindness, David's eyes filled with tears as he expressed his profound gratitude to the chauffeur, saying these acts of kindness had truly saved them.
At the end of that long but fulfilling meeting day, I stepped out of the building to find my driver waiting. As soon as I got into the car, I eagerly asked him about David and the baby, wondering if they had safely arrived at my father's house. My driver assured me they had made it there safely and promised to check on them tomorrow to ensure they had everything they needed. In that moment, I felt deeply validated in my decision to help them. Later that night, lying in bed, I found myself contemplating the impact of my actions. My father's words echoed in my mind about how a person's worth isn't measured by what they possess, but by what they can give to others. I knew in my heart I had to keep living by those words. A few days later, I received a letter from David that touched my soul deeply. His words of gratitude flowed across the page, expressing how much our help had meant to them. He wrote that meeting someone like me was a miracle, and they would spend their lives paying this kindness forward. Reading his letter brought a smile to my face as I realized I was truly living my father's teachings. I felt a genuine satisfaction in knowing I had helped others in need. Right then, I made a silent promise to myself to continue doing whatever I could to help others. I felt like I had discovered a new purpose in my life, something beyond my success or social status. When I arrived home that evening, I found Deborah, my father's caregiver, waiting anxiously at the entrance. She told me with visible concern that my father had taken the house keys and gone there as soon as I'd left, saying he wanted to spend a few days there. My heart skipped a beat when I heard he had gone alone. I immediately started worrying about his health and safety. Deborah explained that he had deliberately chosen to go while I was traveling, knowing I would have stopped him. She said he had insisted he would be fine on his own. Feeling increasingly anxious about the stress this might put on his health, I immediately asked my driver to take me there. As we drove through the city streets, worry gnawed at my heart. When we arrived, my blood ran cold at the sight of an ambulance parked outside and the front door slightly ajar. My heart pounding, I rushed inside to find my father being loaded onto a stretcher. In a panic, I ran to the paramedics, identifying myself as his daughter. When I asked the doctor what had happened, he calmly explained that my father had suffered a stroke, but thankfully, my husband had acted quickly and called the ambulance. His words struck me like a thunderbolt as I realized David had saved my father's life. I trembled at the thought of what might have happened if David hadn't been there. Before getting into the ambulance with my father, I turned to David to express my gratitude. I tried to lighten the moment by telling him that the doctor had mistaken him for my husband. David responded with gentle humility, saying he had only done what anyone would have done, that he just happened to be there. I noticed that David had only purchased the bare necessities for himself and his daughter. I expressed my concern about whether they had enough, telling him he could have bought more freely. David looked at me with eyes full of gratitude, saying he didn't want to take advantage of my generosity as I had already done so much for them. In that moment, I felt a deep connection forming between us. While staying by my father's side, I realized this experience had become a profound lesson in my life. At the hospital, though worried about my father's condition, I felt relieved we had made it in time. I promised David I would check on them the next morning, then spend the night with my father. His recovery was progressing well, and the doctor said he could be discharged in a few days. When I returned home, I found myself wanting to know more about how David and his daughter were doing. I gently asked David to tell me more about himself and his daughter, about how they had come to this situation, if he felt comfortable sharing. David sighed deeply, hesitating whether to tell his story. Looking at his daughter, then at me, he quietly began to speak. He told me he had never seen his mother's face. He shared about his difficult childhood with his father, describing him as a stranger who was lost in alcohol and never acknowledged David's existence. I listened intently as he spoke every word. He explained how he had wanted to study but his father wouldn't allow it, so he would read books in secret after his father fell asleep, dreaming of a better future. David paused for a moment, lost in his memories, before continuing. He described how things got worse over time, with his father sinking deeper into alcoholism despite David's attempts to help, becoming violent and abusive most of the time. His voice shifted from sadness to surprise and disbelief as he continued his story. He told me about meeting a woman who seemed very kind, and how she became pregnant as they spent time together, telling me how terrified he was but also hopeful about finally having a family. David's voice trembled as he spoke. He revealed how she had abandoned him as soon as she learned of the pregnancy, and he never heard from her again. He continued his story, describing how one day, while trying to rebuild his life, he heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found a basket on the ground with a baby wrapped in blankets and a note saying she wanted nothing more to do with either of them. David's eyes filled with love as he recalled that moment. He explained how that day had completely changed his life, suddenly bearing the responsibility for this tiny life alone, but how his daughter had become the light in his dark world. I listened while fighting back tears. When I asked him how they had survived, he told me about seeking help and how other struggling people on the streets had helped them, admitting he had been scared to trust anyone but knew he had to be strong for his daughter. I looked at David, seeing the pain and fear on his face, but also his incredible strength. I told him how amazing he was, acknowledging the pain of his story but praising his perseverance. David smiled sadly, saying he had no choice, that though life hadn't been kind to them, he was determined to do anything for his daughter. He continued, telling me how seeing my father's books at the house had felt like heaven, as he loved reading but had never had access to so many books before. I couldn't help but smile at his words. I told him he could read all the books and think of them as his own. Standing up and preparing to leave, I handed David an envelope, telling him to use it for living expenses. David took the envelope, and when he checked inside, his eyes widened at the amount. His voice trembling, David said he couldn't accept such a large sum. I smiled encouragingly, insisting he take it to buy what he and his daughter needed. Tears welled up in David's eyes as he expressed his gratitude, saying I had given him more than help, I had given him hope. A moment of silence fell between us. Then I saw in David's face that he wanted to ask something. He hesitantly asked if I was married. I sighed softly, a wave of sadness crossing my face, and told him that I had been married once, but my husband died in an accident just 1 month after our wedding, 3 years ago. David was shocked and covered his mouth apologetically, saying he was so sorry and hadn't known. I shook my head slightly, telling him it was okay, that while it had been hard, I had learned to accept it, and though the pain never completely goes away, I could move forward. David nodded deeply, clearly in awe of my strength. Through our shared experiences of hardship and loss, an unexpected bond had formed between David and me. As I stood up and took my keys, David gave me a modest smile and expressed his heartfelt thanks. I smiled back and told him to take care, reminding him that he wasn't alone anymore. With those words, I left. David remained seated, wrapped in feelings of gratitude, hope, and a sense of new connection. The next day, I visited the hospital to check on my father's condition. He was stable but still needed ongoing care. Sitting beside his hospital bed, I told him about David and his daughter. I explained in detail how David had called the doctor when my father collapsed, and about David's difficult life story. My father Eric listened carefully, and responded with subtle emotion in his expression, saying I had done a good thing and that David seemed like a wonderfully brave man. In a weak but proud voice, he continued, telling me how happy he was that I had grown into such a kind-hearted woman, and that he needed to thank God for giving him the strength to raise me. Then he suggested inviting David and the baby to live with us, saying it would make the house livelier and save me the trouble of going to visit them. I pondered his suggestion. The idea of having David and his daughter close by seemed very appealing. I told my father it was a good idea and that I would talk to David about it, agreeing that having them in our home would surely make our lives brighter. He smiled excitedly, clearly buoyed by this possibility. My father mentioned how wonderful it would be to have a small child in the house, saying the house wouldn't be so quiet when I was away at work. Feeling hopeful about this new idea, I said goodbye to my father and promised to discuss the proposal with David. When I returned home, I found David in the living room, playing with his daughter while tidying up, the baby quietly playing on the floor. I sat down near David and told him I wanted to talk about something. David looked at me curiously, wondering what was on my mind. Taking a deep breath and organizing my thoughts, I began to explain. I told him how my house was large and had become very quiet since my father's illness, adding that my father loved reading and could enjoy books together with him, and might even help him with his studies. David was surprised by my suggestion, asking if I meant for him and his daughter to live in my house. I nodded, confirming that was exactly what I meant. David fell silent for a moment, contemplating my proposal. Finally, he responded, saying it was a wonderful offer and he was truly grateful, as it would be a huge help for them and would allow him to study more. I felt relieved and smiled happily, saying it was settled then and would be good for everyone. David smiled gratefully and immediately began gathering his and his daughter's belongings. After collecting everything they needed, they moved into my house. When they arrived, David couldn't hide his amazement at the size and beauty of the house. I smiled and thanked him, expressing my hope that he and his daughter would be comfortable here. In the days that followed, David and my father Eric grew increasingly close. My father enthusiastically showed David interesting books from his vast collection, sharing ones he had loved in his younger years. David would take each book, flipping through the pages while expressing his gratitude and interest. I witnessed their growing bond day by day, my heart filling with joy at the sound of constant laughter from the library, their discussions about characters and stories, and seeing the light return to my father's eyes after so long. I felt deeply grateful for the changes David and his daughter brought to our home. The hope and joy they brought enriched all our lives. David and I gradually developed a family-like bond. I could feel how my father Eric had regained his joy through his days with David, and how the house had become more lively than before. During this time, I made an important decision. I realized we no longer needed the caregiver who had been visiting several times a week to look after my father, as David had willingly taken on this role and his presence was proving to be the best help my father could have. David told me how much he genuinely enjoyed taking care of my father. David emphasized this with deep sincerity. Grateful for his feelings, I spontaneously hugged him, telling him he was already part of our family and that both my father and I were so thankful to have him and his daughter with us. As David began settling into life in my home, I started thinking about supporting not just his living situation but also his financial independence. One day while talking in the kitchen, I carefully brought up the subject. I told David, with a serious expression, that I had been thinking about paying him a salary for all the wonderful care he was giving my father and the house, believing he should have his own income. David looked surprised, protesting that it wasn't necessary since we were already providing a home and everything he and his daughter needed. I gently explained that I understood, but it was important to me that he feel free and independent. I wanted him and his daughter to be able to buy what they needed on their own. David responded with a voice thick with emotion, expressing his deep gratitude, and saying he had never felt so valued and free in all these years. From that day forward, David began receiving regular wages from me, experiencing financial independence again after so long. He was able to buy new clothes for his daughter, select books for himself, and even save for the future. He regained his sense of security and confidence, feeling how my kindness and respect were helping him rebuild his life. Gradually, my relationship with David grew even more intimate and warm. I found myself enjoying the time spent with his daughter Sarah, taking walks together and playing with smiles on our faces. During this time, I confided in my father about my feelings. I told him I might be falling in love with David, something I hadn't felt in years, but I wasn't sure what to do. My father smiled understandingly, telling me life was too short to hesitate and that I deserved happiness, encouraging me to tell David how I felt. Encouraged by his words, I decided to express my feelings to David. That night, I approached David as he was reading in the living room. I sat beside him, my heart pounding, and told him I needed to talk about something important. David closed his book and looked at me seriously, asking what was wrong. Taking a deep breath and gathering my courage, I began to speak. I told him that over these months, I had developed feelings beyond friendship, that he and Sarah had brought light to my life and this house, and that he had become incredibly precious to me. David was surprised by my words, but his heart was racing too. He had been harboring the same feelings but had been hiding them, afraid of taking advantage of my generosity. With a trembling voice, David told me he felt the same way, that what I had done for them was incredibly wonderful. Taking my hand, he continued, saying he wanted to be by my side, not just as a friend but as something more special. The feelings that had grown between us opened a new chapter in both our lives. We could sense love and trust bringing new light to this house. As David and my relationship blossomed, we confirmed our love for each other. That night, as we embraced and shared a passionate kiss, our bond grew deeper than ever before, but our happiness also brought new challenges in its wake. When David began accompanying me to social events as my partner, people's reactions varied greatly. Some people cruelly referred to him as the homeless man I had picked up, and rumors began to spread throughout our social circle. At events, I could feel the cold stares and hear the whispers, but I stood proudly by David's side, never wavering in my support. During a cocktail party at an art gallery, Diane approached us. She greeted us with a smile and congratulated us on our relationship, saying she had heard about us. I noticed David politely thanking her, though I could sense his unease whenever she looked at him. Diane then invited us to dinner at her house the following week. I hesitated momentarily but felt socially obligated to accept, exchanging a glance with David before agreeing. When the dinner evening arrived, David and I found ourselves at Diane's magnificent mansion. We were both taken aback by the grandeur of the house and its exquisite decorative details. Diane welcomed us warmly and showed us to our seats. As dinner progressed, Diane began sharing stories about her past. While we listened to her hardships, the purpose of her stories remained unclear, so I asked her directly why she had invited us. Diane took a deep breath and left the room, returning with an old photo album. She showed us a photograph of her younger self, clearly pregnant. David and I stared at the photo, unable to comprehend what was unfolding. I asked her where the child was. Diane looked at David with tears in her eyes and revealed that he was her son. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over us. David and I exchanged shocked glances, both of us at a loss for words. David asked in a trembling voice if he was really her son. Diane's revelation hit us like a thunderbolt, leaving us all stunned. I responded with disbelief, reminding her that David had told me he had never seen his mother's face, and asked if she was certain he was her son. David struggled to process this information, his eyes darting between me and Diane as he tried to accept this new reality. Diane began telling her story with emotion-filled eyes, explaining how she had met David's father when she was young. She told us that although he had struggled with alcohol, she had thought he was a wonderful person at the time. She explained that after she became pregnant with David and he was born, his father's condition had deteriorated significantly. As Diane continued her story, the truth about David's past gradually came to light. This unexpected reunion marked a turning point in both their lives. With a trembling voice, Diane began to tell us about her past and how she had lost David. She explained that his father had become increasingly aggressive and had taken him away on the day of their discharge from the hospital, disappearing without a trace. I could hear the deep emotion in her voice as she continued her story. We all sat silently at the table, listening intently as she described how she had searched desperately for them. She told us she had hired detectives and spent her fortune, but it was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving no clues behind. I watched as David absorbed these words, struggling with anger while trying to understand the pain and despair Diane had experienced. David asked in a shaking voice if the man who raised him had stolen him from her. Diane nodded through her tears, telling us that he had taken away the most precious thing in her life, and she had spent most of her life searching for David. Fighting through his emotions, David asked how she could be sure he was her son and why she had found him now. Diane replied with an expression of both relief and pain. She explained that when she first saw him with me, something had screamed inside her heart, an intuition she couldn't ignore. She also mentioned the distinctive birthmark on his hand that matched her own, which was the final physical proof. Diane continued, her voice thick with emotion, telling us how she had asked her long-trusted detective to investigate David. She explained how they had finally found his father, drunk on the streets, who had revealed everything when the detective offered him a drink. As Diane's story unfolded, more and more truths came to light. She explained how David's father had kept him off the records and worked anonymously to avoid being found by her. David listened quietly, processing these hidden truths about his past. He realized that his father had lived in fear of being found, keeping David trapped in those shadows. David took deep breaths as he processed the truth Diane was sharing. Then Diane explained that she had arranged for his father to be sent to a care facility, where he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and would spend the rest of his life. She told David that while she had felt angry at his father for a long time, seeing David now filled her with so much happiness that she couldn't hold on to that anger anymore. David responded with mixed emotions, thanking Diane and expressing gratitude for taking care of his father, even though he was still processing everything. This reunion changed David's life dramatically, and he began meeting regularly with Diane to rebuild their lost parent-child relationship. During one of their intimate conversations, Diane asked David about his long-held dream of studying architecture. David smiled and confirmed that he had always wanted to study architecture but never had the chance. Diane smiled gently and told him it was time to fulfill that dream, offering to pay for his education at the country's best architectural school. David was speechless with emotion at her words, unable to express his gratitude adequately. Diane reached across the table to take his hand, telling him she would do anything to make up for lost time and that she wanted to create a room for Sarah here and watch her granddaughter grow up. The bond between David and Diane grew stronger with each passing day. Years later, David reached a significant milestone when he graduated from architectural school. At his graduation ceremony, David stood on stage and gave a heartfelt speech of gratitude. I watched as he spoke about being there because of all the special people who had supported him. His words touched Diane's heart deeply when he called her mother and said that the family and love she had given him were his greatest treasures. Diane listened with tears streaming down her face, finally feeling rewarded for all her years of suffering and uncertainty. After the ceremony, David and Diane shared a long embrace, their deep love making up for all the lost years. Several years after that graduation day, my home had transformed completely. David had established his own architectural firm and found great success. His buildings were known for combining functionality with beauty, and he received particular acclaim for his social housing projects, which were frequently featured in the media. I had published a new novel that explored the theme of family reconnection. The book touched many readers' hearts as it portrayed how lost bonds could be reformed in new ways. My father was enjoying a peaceful retirement while watching his granddaughter Sarah grow up. His study featured a custom bookshelf designed by David, filled with books they had read together. Sarah would sit on my father's lap, opening books and asking him to read them to her. He would always respond with a gentle smile, calling her his precious granddaughter. Diane visited every weekend, spending time with David and Sarah as if trying to make up for lost time. She had let go of her social status and luxurious lifestyle, choosing instead a simpler but richer life. David would show her his new project designs, asking for her opinion. Diane would respond proudly, praising his work, especially his masterful use of natural light. One day at a charity event, I encountered the same people who had once looked down on David, but their attitudes had completely changed. They praised David's latest projects and expressed admiration for his social consciousness. I responded with a calm smile, telling them that he was indeed wonderful and that people shouldn't be judged by appearances or circumstances. Their faces reddened at my words, and they fell silent. When I returned home, I found David absorbed in new design plans in his study. I hugged him from behind and whispered how proud I was of him. David turned to look at me, saying that our meeting in the rain that day had been the beginning of everything, and none of this would have happened if I hadn't reached out to them. I gently replied that we had saved each other. Just then, Sarah burst into the room, announcing that Grandma had arrived. Diane picked up her granddaughter while smiling at David and me, telling us about her new project idea to build a support facility for homeless mothers and children. David and I looked at each other and nodded in agreement. I told him what a wonderful idea it was, and David promised to create the best design possible. Sarah, looking sleepy in her grandmother's arms, said she wanted to help people just like her parents when she grew up. Her words filled everyone in the room with warmth. One weekend, as we were enjoying a family meal in the garden, David quietly began speaking about visiting his father at the facility. The air seemed to freeze for a moment, but Diane gently took her son's hand. David explained that his father deeply regretted his actions and was slowly recovering through his schizophrenia treatment. He told us, with a deep sigh, that he had decided to forgive his father, saying that holding on to hatred would not create anything positive. Looking at Sarah, he said he wanted to teach his daughter about the importance of love and forgiveness. I placed my hand on my husband's shoulder while Diane embraced her son with tears in her eyes. That night in our bedroom, I asked David if he had any regrets about our life and the choices we had made. David looked at me and said he had none, that each day was filled with gratitude, and that everything had changed when I appeared that rainy day when he had almost lost hope. We gazed at the full moon outside our window, discussing our future plans for the new support facility, Sarah's future, and most importantly, the loving family bonds we had built. The next morning at breakfast, Sarah suddenly announced that she wanted to become an architect like her father, to build houses for people in need, and write books like her mother. The whole family exchanged warm smiles, feeling how love and compassion were being passed down through generations. I never imagined that my spontaneous decision on that rainy day would create such immense happiness. Now I was surrounded by a loving family, and that love grew deeper with each passing day. I wrote secretly in my diary that life sometimes takes unexpected turns, but following your heart always opens new paths. I wrote that our family was living proof that with love and forgiveness, any past could be overcome, and hope always lay ahead. David continued to shine as a successful architect, while I flourished as a renowned author, walking our paths together. Our story continued to inspire hope and courage in many people. Above all, our family bonds stood as testament to the miracle that love and forgiveness could create.